The night had never felt so heavy on her shoulders. Avery sat alone in a dimly lit apartment, a single lamp casting long shadows across the bare walls. Only months ago, those same shoulders carried the weight of empires, fortunes, and power. People once fought for her attention, newspapers printed her name in gold letters, and everyone wanted to be seen in her orbit. Now, no one even remembered to call. The silence of that room was louder than 1,000 boardrooms, and Avery could feel it press against her chest like a punishment. She had fallen from heights no one thought possible, and the world did not offer mercy. The phone on the table buzzed with another reminder of overdue bills. She didn't even flinch anymore. Pride stopped her from asking for help, yet pride also burned her every day. What was the worth of pride when you couldn't even afford peace of mind? Avery stared at the blank page of a notebook, once used to sketch plans of skyscrapers and investments, now empty because she had nothing left to design. Her name had become a curse in business circles. Investors abandoned her, employees scattered, and friends vanished like smoke. She had trusted the wrong people, believed the wrong promises, and one wrong step became the slide that destroyed everything. Somewhere else in the same city, Sammy brushed charcoal across a canvas in her modest studio. She had no expensive clothes, no servants at her door, no glittering ballroom to show off. But she had something Avery didn't: peace. Sammy had admired Avery once from afar, like millions of others. She remembered seeing Avery's face on magazine covers and TV interviews, sharp words, and brilliant confidence that lit up any room. To Sammy, Avery had been untouchable, almost unreal, like a star too bright to approach. Now that star had fallen, and fate, cruel or kind, was about to place them in each other's path. It began with a news story. Sammy sipped cheap coffee while scrolling her phone when she saw Avery's name again. Not in glory, not in triumph, but in pity. Former billionaire seen leaving court, assets frozen. The picture was harsh, Avery's face tired, eyes hollow, yet something in her posture still refused to bend. Sammy's heart twisted. She should have turned the screen off, should have ignored it like everyone else did, but she couldn't. Something about that picture made her whisper to herself, "She's still fighting." Avery tried to fight, yes. That same afternoon, she put on her last tailored jacket, the one that still carried a faint scent of expensive perfume, and forced herself out. She walked into a cafe where she once closed million-dollar deals, only now no one looked up. To most, she was a ghost of a story better forgotten. She ordered the cheapest coffee, coins clinking on the counter, and carried it to a corner table. Her hand shook when she lifted the cup. She hated that. She hated being seen weak. That was when Sammy noticed her. Noticed the loneliness, the trembling fingers that once signed contracts worth empires. Sammy hesitated, fear of crossing a line, fear of approaching someone she only admired from a distance. But something stronger pulled her forward. She didn't want to be like the rest of the world that turned their backs. So, with her sketchbook tucked under her arm, she walked toward Avery. Avery's eyes flicked up, sharp and cold, the same eyes that used to silence rooms. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice brittle but still carrying the edge of authority. Sammy swallowed her nerves and smiled softly. "Nothing. Just to sit. You look like you could use someone not asking for anything." For a moment, Avery almost told her to leave. Almost pushed her away like she pushed everyone. But there was something disarming about the way Sammy spoke, calm, steady, without pity. Against her instincts, Avery let her sit. The silence between them was thick at first. Avery tapped the rim of her cup. Sammy flipped her sketchbook open and started drawing lines without purpose, giving Avery space. The air shifted slowly. Avery looked at her drawing, at the rough strokes of a half-formed figure. "Who's that supposed to be?" she asked. Sammy shrugged. "Someone trying not to break." The words cut deep, sharper than Avery expected. She turned away quickly, but Sammy saw the flicker of pain cross her face. The cafe buzzed around them, people laughing, waiters rushing, but in that corner it was just two women carrying different weights. Avery wanted to believe she didn't need anyone, but her heart, bruised and desperate, betrayed her. For the first time in months, someone had sat with her without judgment, without demands. Sammy didn't care about the empire Avery lost. She cared about the humans still standing among the ruins. As they sat there, neither knowing what tomorrow would bring, a strange kind of spark lit between them, not fireworks, not a storm, but a quiet flame born in the ashes of Avery's fall. It was the beginning of something neither of them could name yet, but both would feel in their bones. And Avery, though she wouldn't admit it, felt less alone that night than she had in a very long time. Avery never planned to see Sammy again. That quiet encounter at the cafe had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She told herself it was nothing, just a stranger with kind eyes who sat for a few minutes before walking away. But when Avery returned to her apartment that night, she could not stop replaying the simple way Sammy had spoken, the ease with which she filled silence without demanding anything. For someone who had spent her life surrounded by people who only stayed for profit, that kind of presence felt dangerous. Avery told herself not to think about it. She had too many problems. The creditors were circling, the lawsuits were piling up, and her pride was tearing at her ribs like claws. Yet when she closed her eyes, she saw the curve of Sammy's smile, steady and calm, as if it could hold back storms. The next week Avery dragged herself to meetings that ended in slammed doors and false promises. People who once begged for her attention now used her name as a warning to others. She was toxic, a ruin, a symbol of arrogance. She walked out of one meeting in the pouring rain, her jacket soaked, mascara streaked, and she felt the weight of every whisper. As she stood under the awning of a building, trying to collect herself, she heard a familiar voice. "You're going to catch a cold standing like that." Avery turned, surprised, and there was Sammy, holding a sketch portfolio under her coat, hair damp from the rain. Avery's first instinct was to scoff, to pretend she didn't care, but her throat tightened. She didn't want to be seen like this. Sammy stepped closer, her gaze steady but gentle. "Let me walk you somewhere dry," she offered, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Avery wanted to refuse, but her body betrayed her with a shiver. She let Sammy guide her into a small gallery nearby, a quiet place with soft lighting and paintings hanging on white walls. It wasn't grand, but it was warm, and for the first time that day Avery didn't feel exposed to the world's cruelty. Sammy bought them both coffee from the gallery's small counter and handed Avery the cup without a word. Avery stared at her, frustrated by how easily this woman kept appearing in her life, breaking through walls she had spent years building. They sat on a bench, surrounded by colors and brushstrokes. Avery sipped, forcing her hands not to tremble, and finally asked, "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Sammy tilted her head, considering her answer. Maybe because I see someone who's hurting, and I know what that feels like. Or maybe because I've always wanted to know you beyond the headlines. Avery's heart gave a painful twist. Beyond the headlines, she couldn't even remember the last time anyone cared about that version of her. Everyone wanted her money, her influence, her downfall. But Sammy looked at her as if she were human. Avery tried to regain control of the moment. You think you know me, but you don't. I've made mistakes. I've ruined things. She almost wanted to scare Sammy away, to push her out before she could get too close. But Sammy didn't flinch. Everyone ruins things. Everyone makes mistakes. That doesn't erase everything else you are. The words sat between them, heavy and dangerous, like a key waiting to unlock something Avery had locked away. She looked down, unable to meet Sammy's eyes, afraid of what she might see there. Pity, desire, maybe both. Days turned into a rhythm neither of them acknowledged. Avery would find herself at the cafe again, and somehow Sammy would be there, sketching, sipping coffee, offering conversation that was never forced. Sometimes they spoke about nothing, art, the weather, old books. Sometimes Avery let pieces of herself slip out, the story of a deal she had worked for years that ended in betrayal, the fear of losing the last property her family owned, the shame of being seen as weak. Sammy listened without judgment, only nodding, sometimes offering words that felt like balm. The more Avery shared, the more she realized how starved she was for someone who didn't want to exploit her pain. One evening, Sammy invited her to her studio. Avery resisted, but curiosity won. The space was small, filled with canvases leaned against walls, jars of brushes, the faint smell of paint in the air. It was messy but alive, so different from the sterile boardrooms Avery used to rule. Sammy showed her sketches, portraits, abstract pieces, and one painting that caught Avery off guard. It was unfinished, raw lines forming the outline of a woman standing in shadows. Avery stared, recognizing herself even without details. "That's me," she whispered. Sammy hesitated before nodding. "I started it after the cafe. I couldn't get your expression out of my head. You looked like someone holding back an ocean." Avery wanted to be angry, to accuse her of overstepping, but instead tears burned her eyes. She turned away quickly, ashamed of her weakness. Sammy didn't reach for her, didn't speak. She just let the silence hold them. For Avery, that silence was more intimate than any embrace. It was terrifying to be seen so deeply, yet something in her chest eased for the first time in months. She hated how much she needed it, how much she needed Sammy. When she finally left the studio, the city lights seemed less cruel. She walked home with the faintest sense that maybe she wasn't as completely ruined as she thought. And though she would never admit it aloud, she knew the reason was the woman with charcoal on her fingers and fire in her eyes who refused to let her drown in silence. The air between them had started to change, and Avery felt it even when she tried to deny it. She noticed the way her heart steadied when Sammy entered a room, the way her breathing softened when their conversation stretched into the night. She had never let anyone this close before, not when she was powerful, not when her empire was untouchable. Back then, closeness was a liability. People only came close to steal, to compete, to gain. But Sammy wasn't asking for anything, and that made her presence dangerous in a different way. It was harder to keep her out. Harder to pretend she didn't need her. They spent more time together, at first under the excuse of helping Avery find a way to restart something of her life. Avery still had a project lingering in the ashes of her downfall, a property she wanted to restore, one piece of her past she wasn't willing to let go of. She asked Sammy to design something for it, almost testing her, almost daring her to say no. Sammy agreed without hesitation. They began working late nights, sitting across from each other with paper scattered and ideas flowing. Avery's sharp mind returned in flashes as she debated layouts and costs, while Sammy's creativity filled the gaps with visions Avery never would have seen. What surprised Avery was how good they were together, how their differences fit like puzzle pieces. Where Avery pushed too hard, Sammy softened. Where Sammy dreamed too big, Avery grounded. In those nights, the silence between them became thick with something unspoken. Avery would catch herself staring at Sammy's hands as she sketched, steady and graceful, leaving trails of life on the page. She would catch herself watching the curve of her smile when she explained an idea with excitement, eyes glowing. Avery hated herself for noticing. She told herself it was just loneliness, just the hunger of someone who had lost everything and clung to the nearest light. But when Sammy leaned close to point at a drawing, when their shoulders brushed, Avery felt something raw and real she hadn't felt in years. The struggle inside her was unbearable. She had always been the woman who could command attention, who could enter a room and bend it to her will. She was used to being desired but never to desiring, never to feeling powerless in the presence of another. Sammy reversed all of that without even trying. One night, Avery couldn't sleep. She paced her apartment, restless, her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. She remembered Sammy's laugh from earlier, the way her eyes crinkled when Avery teased her. The memory hit harder than the champagne-soaked parties she used to drown in. It was real, and it scared her more than the bankruptcy ever did. Sammy, on the other hand, was already caught. She didn't tell Avery, but she had been drawn to her long before the cafe. She had admired her strength from afar, but what she found now was something different, fragility beneath the armor, a woman who had lost everything yet still carried herself with a spark of defiance. Sammy wanted to be the one to hold up brokenness without judgment. She wanted Avery to see herself the way Sammy did, not as a ruin, but as a survivor. Still, Sammy held back. She knew Avery was fighting wars inside herself, and she refused to push too soon. Their bond deepened further when Avery broke down one evening without warning. They were reviewing designs, and something reminded her of the empire she had lost. She froze, her voice caught in her throat, and before she could stop herself, tears welled in her eyes. She hated crying in front of anyone. She hated exposing the wound. But Sammy reached across the table and simply laid her hand over Avery's, no words, just warmth. Avery's chest tightened until she thought she might shatter. She wanted to pull away, but she didn't. Instead, she let her hand stay under Sammy's, trembling slightly, the contact more intimate than anything she had allowed in years. That moment lingered between them for days. Avery tried to pretend it hadn't happened, tried to bury the memory, but her body betrayed her. She craved that touch, craved the safety it gave her. The next time Sammy brushed against her by accident, Avery felt heat rise in her chest and couldn't look her in the eye. She knew she was crossing a line she had drawn for herself long ago. One evening, as they stood outside Sammy's studio, Avery finally cracked. The night was cold, their breath forming clouds in the air. Sammy was unlocking the door when Avery spoke suddenly, her voice low, almost broken. "Why do you stay? Why do you keep showing up for me when I have nothing to give you?" Sammy froze, then turned slowly to face her. Her answer came without hesitation. "Because I don't want anything from you. I want you." The words hung in the night air, heavy and undeniable. Avery's heart pounded so hard she thought it would break her ribs. She wanted to run, to shut the door on the feeling rising between them, but she couldn't move. Sammy's gaze held her, steady and unflinching, and Avery realized with terror and relief that she wanted to believe her. She wanted to surrender. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, silence stretched, thick and charged, and Avery felt her world tilt on its axis. For the first time since her empire fell, she was more afraid of her own heart than of losing everything again. The days that followed carried a strange heaviness, like the world was watching Avery too closely, waiting for her to stumble again. She had begun to allow herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years: connection, the warmth of Sammy's presence, the possibility of love, but life had a way of striking when her defenses were weakest. One morning, as she skimmed through her phone in silence, her screen lit up with a headline that turned her blood cold. Her former partner, the man who had orchestrated much of her downfall, had given an interview. He painted her as a fraud, a reckless woman who had destroyed not only her own empire but everyone who had trusted her. His words spread like wildfire. Articles piled on, news anchors dissected her choices with cruel satisfaction, and strangers online used her name as a symbol of arrogance and failure. It felt like a fresh trial, one where she had no voice to defend herself. Avery tried to brush it off, but it tore at her. Every word brought back the sting of betrayal, every cruel comment reminded her of how quickly people had abandoned her. By afternoon, the storm had reached her door. Old acquaintances texted her, not with concern, but with smug remarks disguised as pity. Investors who once begged for her attention now publicly distanced themselves, as though she were a poison. She slammed her phone on the table, her hands shaking. Rage and shame blended into a storm she couldn't contain. Sammy found her that evening, pacing her apartment like a caged animal, her hair disheveled, her eyes red from fighting tears. Avery snapped the moment Sammy stepped in. "Do you see what they're saying about me? Do you see how they love to watch me bleed?" Her voice cracked between fury and despair. Sammy moved closer, steady as always, but Avery lashed out before she could speak. "Don't look at me like that. Don't you dare pity me. You don't know what it's like to be torn apart in front of the whole world." The words were sharp, cruel even, but they came from a place of pain she could no longer hold back. For a moment, Sammy stood in silence, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, calm but firm. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to lose an empire. But I do know what it's like to lose everything that matters and still have to wake up the next morning. Pain doesn't compete, Avery. It connects us." Her voice was steady, but her eyes carried fire. "And if you think I'm here out of pity, you don't see me at all." The words struck deeper than Avery expected. She froze, the fight draining out of her, leaving only exhaustion. She wanted to argue, to push Sammy away like she had pushed everyone else, but something in Sammy's gaze held her still. For once, Avery felt seen not as a failure, not as a former billionaire, but as a woman trapped in her own wounds. That realization broke something inside her, and tears spilled before she could stop them. Sammy crossed the room then, not with grand gestures but with quiet certainty. She reached for Avery's hand, and this time Avery didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, and Avery trembled as though that simple contact might undo her completely. "You don't have to fight this alone," Sammy whispered. "Let me stand with you." Avery wanted to believe her, but fear clawed at her ribs. Trust had destroyed her once. Love had never been safe for her. She had lived her entire life expecting betrayal, and now here was someone offering loyalty with nothing asked in return. It was too much, too fragile, too real. She pulled her hand free and turned away, pressing her palms to her face. "I can't. I don't know how to let anyone stay," she admitted, her voice muffled and broken. Sammy didn't leave. She sat quietly on the couch, giving Avery the space to crumble without judgment. The silence stretched, heavy yet comforting, until Avery finally sat beside her, drained of strength. For the first time, she leaned her head against Sammy's shoulder, allowing herself to rest there. She felt Sammy's breath steady, slow, anchoring her in the chaos. No one had ever given her that kind of stillness. It terrified her how much she needed it. That night, they didn't speak much more. Avery's pride was bruised, her reputation shredded further by the media storm, but she let herself lean into the warmth of Sammy's presence. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't surrender, but it was the first crack in her walls that had kept her heart locked away. For Sammy, it was enough. She knew trust would not come easily. She knew Avery would fight it every step of the way. But as she held Avery's hand gently in the quiet, she promised herself she would not let her face the darkness alone, no matter how many storms tried to tear her apart. Avery woke the next morning with a strange kind of heaviness that wasn't just from exhaustion. It was the weight of realizing she had leaned on someone, even if only for a night, and that she hadn't hated it. She lay still for a long time, staring at the cracks in the ceiling of her small apartment, trying to decide whether it was weakness or survival. Pride told her she had shown too much. Fear whispered that Sammy would think she was fragile, maybe even broken beyond repair. But deep inside, there was something else she couldn't shake, the memory of calm. For once, she had been allowed to let go without collapsing completely, and Sammy had simply been there. No judgment. No pity. Just presence. It scared her almost as much as it soothed her. Work on the property project continued, and with it came a rhythm that began to feel like life again. The building was old, worn by years of neglect, much like Avery herself. She had fought to keep it when everything else was stripped away because it had belonged to her family, one of the last ties she had to a life before the empire. Saving it felt like saving herself. Sammy walked the halls with her, sketchbook in hand, seeing possibility where Avery saw only decay. "This place isn't ruined," Sammy said one afternoon as sunlight streamed through broken windows. "It's waiting. Sometimes beauty just needs someone to believe in it again." Avery looked at her sharply, knowing Sammy wasn't just talking about the building. The words settled in her chest, heavy and warm, stirring emotions she didn't want to name. Nights became longer, filled with scattered blueprints, arguments over design, and unexpected laughter. Avery, who had once been too serious, too controlled, found herself smiling at things she never thought could make her laugh. Sammy teased her when she grew too intense, calling her Queen of Perfection with a smirk that disarmed her anger. And sometimes Avery teased back, surprising herself with how natural it felt. Their closeness deepened in the small, ordinary moments, sharing takeout boxes when they worked too late, trading stories about their childhoods, brushing against each other as they leaned over the same table. Avery began to notice details she had never allowed herself to before, the way Sammy's eyes softened when she listened, the way her hair fell across her face when she was lost in thought, the way her laughter filled empty rooms like sunlight. But intimacy wasn't easy. Avery carried years of scars that didn't fade just because someone offered her warmth. One evening, she confessed more than she intended. They were sitting on the floor surrounded by sketches, and Avery suddenly spoke without thinking. "I used to believe winning was the only way to be worth anything. Every deal, every headline, every dollar, it was all proof I wasn't small, that I wasn't nothing." Her voice trembled as she stared at her hands. "And then it all disappeared. And I realized I had built my life on sand." Sammy listened quietly, her eyes never leaving Avery's face. "You're not nothing," she said softly. "You never were. You're just human. And maybe that's better than being untouchable." The words cut deep, but they also began to heal. Avery wanted to argue, to reject the comfort, but instead she found herself leaning closer, her chest tight with emotions she didn't know how to release. It happened slowly, almost without decision. Sammy reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Avery's face, her fingers lingering just long enough to make Avery shiver. Their eyes locked, silence thick around them, until Avery closed the space between them and pressed her lips to Sammy's. It wasn't a grand, sweeping kiss. It was trembling, hesitant, filled with fear and hunger all at once. Avery pulled back quickly, ashamed of how much it had shaken her. But Sammy didn't recoil. She smiled softly, her voice low. "You don't have to be afraid of wanting something real." The kiss lingered in Avery's mind long after. It haunted her while she tried to sleep, distracted her when she tried to focus. She had told herself for so long that love was a weakness, that attachment was a chain waiting to strangle her. Yet she couldn't deny how alive she felt when she thought of Sammy, how the emptiness inside her seemed less suffocating when Sammy was near. Still, fear shadowed every moment. What if Sammy left? What if this was temporary, another lesson in loss? Avery had built her empire to shield herself from vulnerability, and now here she was, risking it all for someone who had walked into her life by chance. The conflict grew sharper when Sammy revealed she had received an opportunity. It was late, papers scattered across the table, when she mentioned it casually, as though it wasn't life-changing. A chance to exhibit her work in another city, a gallery that could change her career. Avery froze, her chest tightening, though she forced her face to remain composed. She congratulated Sammy, her voice flat, but inside she was already spiraling. The idea of losing her, of waking up without Sammy's laughter in the room, without her presence to keep her anchored, was unbearable. And yet, Avery couldn't bring herself to say it. She couldn't ask Sammy to stay, not when she had nothing left to offer but a broken name and shattered pride. That night, Avery sat alone in the dim light, staring at the empty chair across from her where Sammy usually sat. The thought of it staying empty forever filled her with a fear she couldn't control. She whispered to herself, "If she leaves, I'll break." It was the first time she admitted the truth out loud, even if no one else could hear it. For all her wealth, all her power, all her pride, Avery realized she had never truly needed someone the way she needed Sammy now. And the possibility of losing her was the sharpest knife she had ever faced. Avery had spent her whole life controlling outcomes, bending people to her will, making sure no one ever had the power to leave her first. It was instinct, survival, the reason she once ruled entire industries. But with Sammy, that instinct turned into poison. The gallery offer hung between them like a storm cloud, and Avery couldn't stand the thought of watching her walk away. Every time Sammy spoke about it, her voice tinged with both excitement and hesitation. Avery felt her chest tighten with panic. She wanted to say, stay. Stay with me. I can't do this without you, but the words would never leave her lips. Instead, she began to quietly interfere, convincing herself it was for Sammy's own good. She mentioned flaws in the gallery's reputation, planted seeds of doubt about whether the opportunity was worth leaving everything behind, even hinted that the city wasn't safe for her. On the surface, her voice was calm and logical, but inside she was terrified, clinging to Sammy with invisible chains. Sammy sensed it. At first, she dismissed the feeling, telling herself Avery was only being protective, only trying to look out for her. But as the days passed, the pattern became clear. Every time she showed excitement about the chance, Avery dampened it. Every time she tried to talk about what it would mean for her career, Avery changed the subject or reminded her of the risks. Sammy's heart grew heavy. She loved Avery's fire, but she didn't want that fire to burn her dreams into ash. She wanted love, not control. And yet, she understood where Avery's fear came from, because she had seen the way Avery gripped at the edges of her world, desperate not to lose the only piece of it that still mattered. The tension snapped one evening when Sammy confronted her. They had been working late, papers scattered between them, when Sammy closed her sketchbook and looked directly at Avery. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Avery frowned, pretending not to understand. "Doing what?" Sammy leaned forward, her eyes burning with quiet hurt. "You're trying to keep me here. Every word, every doubt you plant, it's not about the gallery. It's about you being afraid I'll leave. And it's not fair." Avery froze, anger flashing first because anger was easier than fear. "I don't want to see you make a mistake," she snapped. "I don't want you to throw yourself into something that could hurt you." Sammy didn't back down. "No. You don't want me to go because you're afraid of being left behind again. But I'm not them, Avery. I'm not the people who betrayed you. I'm not walking away from you unless you force me to." Her voice cracked, and for a moment the silence between them felt like a canyon. Avery's chest burned as the truth rose to her lips, raw and jagged. "I can't lose you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've lost everything, my name, my power, everything I built. And if you go too, if you walk away, I don't know what will be left of me." Her admission hung in the air, naked and vulnerable, and it terrified her. For years she had ruled through strength, but now she was begging, not with demands but with fear. Sammy's eyes softened, though tears brimmed at the edges. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing Avery's hand. "I don't love you because of what you had. I love you because of who you are when everything is stripped away. Don't you see? I'm here not out of pity or obligation. I'm here because I choose you. But if you try to cage me, if you try to chain me down, you'll destroy the very thing you're afraid of losing." Her words were quiet, but they cut through Avery's defenses with painful clarity. Avery's throat tightened, and for the first time she allowed herself to truly look at Sammy, not as a savior, not as a lifeline, but as a woman with her own dreams, her own light. She realized how unfair it was to dim that light out of fear. Tears slid down her cheeks, unguarded, and she whispered, "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to love without breaking it." Sammy's grip on her hand tightened, grounding her. "Then let's learn together. I don't need perfect. I just need honest. I just need you." The night stretched long after that, their words lingering like a fragile truce. Avery didn't promise to stop being afraid, because she knew fear wasn't something she could erase overnight. But she did promise something else, to try. To stop sabotaging, to stop letting her panic speak louder than her heart. And Sammy, though her own doubts remained, chose to believe in that promise. They sat together in the quiet, fingers entwined, both trembling, both scarred, but unwilling to let go. For Avery, it was a turning point. She had always believed that love was a battlefield of power, that to give her heart meant surrender. But sitting there with Sammy, broken yet still holding on, she realized maybe love wasn't about winning or losing. Maybe it was about choosing to stay even when every instinct screamed to run. And for the first time, she dared to believe that she might be worthy of that choice. The days that followed were softer, but also more fragile, as if every word and gesture carried the weight of something unspoken. Avery tried to keep her promise, to stop pulling Sammy back with fear, but it wasn't easy. The instinct to control, to grip too tightly, lurked just beneath her skin. She would catch herself watching Sammy when she was lost in her art, her chest tightening at the thought that one day she might choose the world outside their fragile little bubble. But then Sammy would glance up, catch her eyes, and smile with that quiet warmth that disarmed her completely, and for a moment Avery would let herself breathe. They lived in that delicate balance, where fear and hope tangled together, where every touch felt like both an anchor and a risk. The project they worked on began to mirror the changes between them. The old building, once crumbling and forgotten, now showed signs of revival. Walls were repainted, broken windows replaced, and empty rooms slowly transformed into spaces filled with light and possibility. Avery poured herself into it, not just because it was her last tie to her old life, but because it felt like a metaphor for what was happening inside her. She was rebuilding too, piece by piece, with Sammy's steady hands beside her. Sometimes she would pause and watch Sammy sketch, her brow furrowed in concentration, and feel a kind of pride that surprised her. It wasn't the pride of possession or power, it was the pride of witnessing someone she cared about thrive. That feeling unsettled her, yet it was also the most real thing she had known in years. One evening, when exhaustion had settled over them both, they sat on the floor of the nearly finished lobby, eating takeout straight from the containers. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint, and for a moment everything felt almost normal. Avery leaned back against the wall, chopsticks dangling in her hand, and said quietly, "I used to think love was just another kind of deal. Something you could negotiate, control, win. But with you," her voice trailed off, unsure if she could finish. Sammy reached over, brushing a stray hair from her cheek, her eyes gentle. "With me, it's not a deal," she said softly. "It's a choice. Every day. And I'm choosing you, even when it's messy." The simplicity of the words unraveled Avery's defenses. She closed her eyes, feeling a sting of tears she didn't try to hide this time, and whispered, "Then I'll choose you too. Even when I'm afraid." That night they kissed again, not with hesitation but with a depth that came from surrender. Avery felt herself unravel in Sammy's arms, the wall she had spent years building crumbling with every touch. It terrified her to give in so completely, but it also set her free. For the first time, she wasn't performing, wasn't protecting an image or fighting for control. She was simply a woman, broken and trying, and still somehow worthy of being held. Sammy kissed her with patience, with tenderness, with the quiet certainty that she wasn't going anywhere. In that embrace, Avery finally allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something lasting, yet even as they grew closer, shadows lingered. Avery still carried the weight of her past, and the world hadn't forgotten who she once was. Whispers of scandal still followed her, reminders of how far she had fallen. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, she would lie awake and wonder if Sammy deserved better, if she was selfish for clinging to someone who could shine brighter without her baggage. But then Sammy would stir in her sleep, curl closer, and Avery would hold her tighter, silently promising that she would fight to be enough. She knew she couldn't erase the mistakes of her past, but maybe she could build something new, something real. In the ruins, the turning point came when the building was finally ready to open. What had once been a symbol of Avery's desperation was now a community space, vibrant and alive, filled with art, laughter, and light. On opening night, Avery stood in the middle of the lobby, surrounded by people who had come not for her name, but for what had been created there. She felt a strange mixture of pride and humility, realizing that this wasn't about reclaiming her old empire. It was about building something that mattered, something that reflected who she was becoming. And beside her, Sammy's hand slipped into hers, grounding her in a way no fortune or power ever had. Later, when the guests had left and the space was quiet again, Avery turned to Sammy with a look of awe. "I thought I needed to rebuild what I lost," she said softly. "But maybe what I really needed was to build something new with you." Sammy smiled, her eyes shining with both love and conviction. "You don't have to rebuild the past," she replied. "We can create our own future, one that doesn't look like anything you've known before." Avery felt her chest tighten, but this time it wasn't fear, it was hope. She pulled Sammy close, holding her as if she finally understood that love wasn't about ownership, but about presence. That night, as they stood in the heart of the building they had resurrected together, Avery realized something profound. She had fallen, lost everything that once defined her, but in that loss, she had found something greater than power or wealth. She had found love that didn't demand perfection, only truth. And for the first time, she believed that maybe she could be more than her mistakes, more than her fall. Maybe she could be worthy of the woman who had chosen her, and of the life they were beginning to build together. The weeks after the opening were unlike anything Avery had known in years. Life settled into a rhythm that wasn't defined by stock prices, boardroom wars, or ruthless deadlines. Instead, it was mornings where Sammy brewed coffee in the little apartment kitchen, humming absent-mindedly while Avery leaned against the counter, simply watching her. It was afternoons spent walking through the building they had saved, watching it come alive with art shows, workshops, and laughter from people who finally had a place to gather. It was nights lying side by side, whispering dreams in the dark, sometimes breaking into laughter, sometimes into silence, sometimes into soft tears neither of them needed to explain. Avery felt herself softening in ways that scared her, but she also felt more alive than she had in her entire existence as a billionaire. Still, the ghosts of her past lingered. There were nights when Avery woke with her heart racing, memories of betrayal and loss pressing down on her like a weight. She would slip out of bed quietly, pacing the floor, staring out the window as if searching for pieces of her old self in the city lights. And every time, Sammy would wake, patting over with sleepy eyes, wrapping her arms around her from behind. "You're here now," Sammy would whisper against her back. "With me. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Those words became a mantra that slowly rewired something inside Avery. She began to understand that she didn't need to erase her scars to be loved. She only needed to let someone see them. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real. They argued sometimes, mostly when Avery's old habits tried to creep back in, her need to control, her fear of losing grip. But Sammy never let those moments turn into walls between them. She met Avery's fire with patience, her doubts with reassurance, her silence with steady presence. And Avery, for the first time, began to practice the terrifying act of letting go of control, of pride, of the need to always appear strong. It wasn't easy. Vulnerability never was. But every time she stumbled, Sammy was there, and every time Sammy faltered, Avery found herself willing to catch her. The gallery offer still lingered in the background, like an unfinished chapter, but something had shifted. Sammy no longer spoke about it with hesitation, and Avery no longer responded with fear. Instead, they talked about it openly, what it would mean, how it could fit into the life they were building. Avery surprised herself by saying one evening, "If you want to go, I'll be behind you." I don't want to be the reason you hold back." The words nearly choked her, but when she saw the tears well in Sammy's eyes, she knew it was the right thing. Sammy kissed her deeply then, whispering, "That's why I'll never leave you. Because you finally see that loving me doesn't mean losing me." Over time, the whispers of scandal that had once followed Avery began to fade. People no longer spoke only of the billionaire who fell, but also of the woman who had created something new from the ashes, who had turned ruin into hope. But Avery realized she no longer cared as much about what the world thought. The only opinion that mattered was Sammy's, and in Sammy's eyes, she saw not pity or judgment, but love. A love that had claimed her not through chains, but through choice. One night, months later, they stood again in the heart of the building, now thriving with life. The event had ended, the lights were dim, and they were alone in the silence. Avery looked around at the space, then at Sammy, and felt something swell in her chest, something deeper than gratitude, heavier than relief. It was the recognition that this woman had not just saved her from falling, but had shown her what it meant to truly live. She reached for Sammy's hand, pulling her close, and whispered, "I thought losing everything was the end. But it was the beginning. Because it led me to you." Sammy cupped her face gently, smiling with that softness that had undone Avery from the start. "You didn't lose everything," she said quietly. "You just lost what didn't matter. And you found what does." They kissed in the silence, not with desperation this time, but with the quiet certainty of two people who had chosen each other again and again. In that moment, Avery knew she was no longer defined by her empire, her fall, or her scars. She was defined by the love she had fought for, the love she had almost pushed away, and the love she now held with open hands. And as they stood there, two women bound not by power but by presence, Avery realized the truth she had run from her entire life. She had not been conquered by loss. She had been claimed by love. And in being claimed, she had finally found herself.